Good afternoon. My name is Gary Simpson. I'd like to welcome each of you, whether you're in person or online, to our first and hopefully many sessions with regard to topics on religious liberty. Before we continue, I'd like to ask our senior pastor, Doug Hart, if he would open with opening prayer.
Let's bow our heads. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for this time that we have on this beautiful Sabbath afternoon to talk about freedom. You've told us in your word that wherever your presence is, there is freedom. So Lord, may you bless our discussion and bless each participant and each hearer, that we might be more free ourselves and help protect others' freedom. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
So since this is the beginning in a series, I wanted to preface a few things before we get started. Then we'll introduce the panel, and I would like to also express thanks to a group of people as well that have made this possible. So the following panel is a discussion that was first discussed amongst the members that are here with me, as well as Jeff Bromley, who unfortunately was not able to join us. But there are many facets that we've identified as people that are interested in this topic that we believe need to be discussed as a church. And with regard to that, we identified several of these topics that we'd like to discuss either in the form of a panel that we're presenting today or as guest speakers. As part of that, we're planning on setting this up as a quarterly schedule, and I'd like to highlight a few things that we'll be discussing in the future. In case your particular interest or topic is not covered today, don't worry, we will eventually get to it. With regard to today's presentation, I'll get into a little more specifics, but we're going to focus on the topic of Christian nationalism. In the next series that we'll be hosting, we already have lined up a guest speaker who will be talking on religious liberty and its historical presence within the Adventist Church. Lest we speak completely of Adventist interest, we also are looking at inviting a guest who can speak to the broader historical nature with regard to religious freedom and religious liberty as it relates to the founding of this nation. Other topics that have also been considered and are likely to be lined up towards the end of next year may include an interfaith discussion where we invite members of various religious faiths and would like to have a panel discussion to express not only a Christian viewpoint, but multiple faith viewpoints. And there are other topics. I won't continue as time is limited. We intend to have this session wrap in an hour at 5 o'clock. So to be brief, if there are other topics of interest that you would like us to address, please send your comments to the YouTube channel that hopefully you're tuned into right now. And we will collect those thoughts and we will try to address them at an appropriate time in this series. As a disclaimer, I want to point out that we're each individuals. We're here to express our views as members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but our views are not necessarily that of the organization. So keep that in mind. We likewise are expressing views not only that we personally hold, but at times we may express a view that we don't necessarily subscribe to give equal weight to both sides of a discussion. I want to express appreciation to several people. First of all, the members of the panel here, Pastor Hart, Mark Bueller, Les Hess. As I mentioned, Jeff Bromley was unfortunately not able to join us today. They were all very helpful in arranging this and coming up with several ideas related to this discussion. I would also like to express appreciation to Mark and Ivy Babienko for assisting us in setting this up and allowing for this live streaming that we're presenting today. At the same time, I'd like to express a great appreciation to the support of the Markham Woods Church staff in supporting this and cheering us on as far as this being a good forum to proceed forward with. We're very hopeful that this whole discussion will open up dialogue. We don't want religious liberty to be a stagnant discussion or an item that is just centered around what may typically be associated with Sabbath work observance and I should say Sabbath observance in regard to work, or some other typical discussions around Sunday laws. Religious liberty and religious freedom are a much broader topic than that, and we would like that to be relevant to all members. Finally, I would like to invite those of you that are online and those of you that are in person, if you have a chance, we unfortunately do not have the setup for the texting to necessarily be readily available to you today. Hopefully that will be in the future. But if you have any comments, questions, please submit those. In the future, we hope to have a live submission of questions available. And those of you that are online, feel free to submit your thoughts and questions as well. With that, I'm going to ask that each one of the panel members, if they would please briefly introduce themselves, and then we will begin the conversation associated around Christian nationalism. Doug, we'll go and start with you if you don't mind.
My name is Doug Hart, and I'm the senior pastor here at Markham Woods Seventh-day Adventist Church.
My name is Mark Bueller. I'm a maritime lawyer, so not necessarily an expert in this topic.
My name is Les Hess, and for many years I was a prosecutor here in Orlando. I'm now a retired lawyer.
And Gary Simpson, I hold no law degree, I'm just an engineer. But I have an interest in this subject as the rest of these gentlemen here. And as Mark pointed out, none of us consider ourselves experts, but we're deeply interested in this topic. And I'm the religious liberty leader here at Markham Woods. So with that, we'll go ahead and kick off our formal discussion for today. To set the stage, I'd like to, based off of some conversations that we've had in preparing for this, Doug has had several life experiences that I've come to appreciate some of the stories he shared. And I think to set the stage, I'd like him to share a little bit of his international experience in the framing of a religious nationalism. And then we'll go from there as how that relates to Christian nationalism. So Doug, if you wouldn't mind sharing a story.
Thanks, Gary. And for those of you who don't know, Gary is our religious liberty director for the Markham Woods Church. And he texted me after a sermon I gave here, a month or so ago, about Christian dominionism and how that affects the way we relate to government and society. So, religious liberty, I think there was some fear among some church members that this is just kind of an esoteric, intellectual Sabbath afternoon activity, and most of our members are just going to be, having some lay activities or out on a walk, and just some people that are kind of interested in it are going to talk about it. I'm really excited about this because religious liberty it's not a big deal until it's a huge deal. And I experienced, as Gary mentioned, living overseas. We moved to the Republic of Georgia in 2001. At that time, Georgia, a little background, Georgia's the second Christian country in the world. They converted to Christianity in 337 AD. There was a saint called Nino, came from Greece, preached to the Georgians, and they became a Christian government in 337 AD. Almost 1,700 years of Christian history. Everybody in Georgia, in their mind, is Orthodox. You're born Georgian, you're born Orthodox. Well, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Orthodoxy came back, Protestant groups came over, Jehovah's Witnesses were working very strongly, and there was one rogue Orthodox priest who officially was excommunicated from the Orthodox Church, who took it upon himself to gather up a bunch of hoodlums, and he would go out and find these sectants. Human Rights Watch had documented 82 times where they would go in with literally bats and sticks, and they would drag people out of their meeting places, and they would beat them up in the street, and the police would just turn a blind eye. They had no legal recourse. There was religious liberty on paper, but there was really, in effect, there wasn't religious liberty. When I got there in 2001, just to show you how important religious liberty is to me, we had to think about every time going to church, are we going to get beat up today? Is there going to be a busload of these rogue Orthodox people that are going to come in and beat us up, and the police will just, it's just the sectants, don't worry about it. Oddly enough, it was almost funny if it wasn't so serious. a Pentecostal group from the Assemblies of God came over, and they were going to dedicate a seminary in Georgia. And the busload of Mama Basili's group showed up, not realizing that they were Americans on the bus. And they just beat them to a pulp and stole their video cameras. And it turns out, at that time, John Ashcroft was Attorney General for the U.S., and he used to be a minister, or his father did, in the Assemblies of God denomination. He gets a call from Georgia saying, hey, this is what's happening. They just beat up a group of Americans now. And George Bush, I think, called the president of Georgia, Edward Shevardnadze, and said, listen, you need to provide religious freedom, otherwise we're going to shut the financial aid dollars off from you guys. All of a sudden, we had all this religious freedom. You wouldn't believe it, how quickly we got it and how nice it was in the country. When I was in Armenia, we had much the same situation, but governments play with this. And in Armenia, you have to have 50 people registered from a religious organization to get a registration, to be able to do anything, to be able to rent a hall, to buy a church, to print books. They were discussing it in Parliament at the time to raise it to 500. And we had about 900 and some Adventists in the church on the books, which means we probably had close to 500 on Sabbath in church. And we weren't sure we were going to be able to convince 500 of our members to sign their names on a document that's available to the government saying that they are now Seventh-day Adventists. Armenia was the first Christian nation in the world, 301 AD, so they were 36 years before the Georgians. And literally, one Armenian told me, hey, when their Armenian is in the womb, he is a Christian. He's an Armenian apostolic Christian. That's their government church. So I went to the U.S. Embassy. The U.S. Embassy, the State Department does every year a religious liberty report for every country in the world. So I was the representative for the Armenian mission, so I went in and from our church and had a talk with him. And it was interesting, in talking with him, he said, well, he asked me, Doug, do you know how many people it takes in America to register a religious organization? I said, no, I've never thought about that. How many? Because here it takes 50 and maybe 500. He said, one. In America, you can file papers, get registered, and have your own religious organization, which I found out. Then I moved back to Nebraska, and if you remember, there was a legal case because there was an inmate at the Nebraska State Penitentiary that was worshiping the spaghetti monster god and wanted to rent or have a worship service in the Nebraska State Penitentiary religious services room, and it went all the way, I think, maybe to the Supreme Court. But anyway, coming back here was just a total difference, and I was a little bit surprised how far off the radar it is off of most of our church members of what a privilege it is to own a property. Sabbath afternoon, we came here. I don't think anybody in this room was concerned about getting shot at or having a group of protesters out there yelling, throwing stuff at us, or some busload of hooligans coming and beating us up, and then not having anywhere to go. There was nowhere to appeal to that. So that's a little bit of my background, the way I approach it, and just to be able to raise these issues and studying a little bit, I think what we're going to get into the next time is the historical side of Adventism that has traditionally fought for religious liberty, not just for ourselves, but for other world religions here in America, for other Christian denominations. And it's really something that, we're supposed to be humble, but the Lord did say brag, about him. And it's one thing that I'm really glad that our church has that spiritual emphasis with God of protecting everybody's religious freedom. And some of this Christian nationalism, as I brought up in the sermon, of dominionism, of trying to take dominion of the government, concerns me. And, one of the questions that arises in my mind is, in Armenia, for instance, there was a group of Armenians that used to be historically Armenia, but they lived in what is now eastern Turkey. Well, Turkey took that land during the Ottoman Empire, but there are Armenians that were stuck there, even after the genocide of 1915. They ended up converting to Islam. Armenians, literally, I talked to a professor, he said Armenians do not want to recognize that there is a group of Armenians that are Muslims. They are persona non grata. It's, you just, how, being Armenian and Muslim is, it's an oxymoron. You can't even say that. So when people talk about Christian nationalism, I just think it's a good topic, a fruitful topic for us to think about, have clear in our minds biblically and socially of what does that mean and can that even be.
So along those lines, and thank you very much for relating that story to us, with regard to those nations have considered that they have a state religion, I guess is basically the way you would state that. And I think if you were to poll Americans, and maybe we'll just have a straw poll here, most people consider us to be a Christian nation, but I think there are aspects with regard to that may be ill-conceived. We do not have a state religion. I think we have quite a few people that affiliate with being Christians, and I would say that that's probably to varying degrees. I'm curious what your perspective is on that relative to, we're talking about an extreme situation with regard to the foreign countries that you mentioned, but where Christian nationalism might lead if it were left unchecked here.
Could I just maybe try to clarify one thing? The bigger picture is religious nationalism. So Christian nationalism happens to be the flavor in this country.
Correct.
But you have, in many Muslim countries, it is Islamic nationalism. In India, it's predominantly Hindu nationalism. In Japan, it's probably Shintoism. So the problem is when you have a merger of state and some religious authority. And so when we talk about Christian nationalism, I think it's fair to say that is the religious flavor, that in the United States is basically seeking to have a preferred position with the government. And there are various institutions that are making it part of their mission to try and kind of Christianize the government here, so that it is more not just your choice, but it's official government policy to favor Christianity.
Yes. Les.
Well, when we say, someone says this is a Christian nation, or weren't we started as a Christian nation, are we still a Christian nation? That's an ambiguous term. The nation was not Christian. The people were Christians. When you read our Constitution, it refers to God, but it doesn't get specific. Christianity or Protestantism or Catholics or whatever was never part of our government, okay? As a matter of fact, originally our government was set up with separate, that the government won't establish a religion, okay? And many of the more active people, the evangelicals are a potent political force and probably had their peaks during the Reagan and Bush eras. But many of our people say, we're a Christian nation, we need to do this or we need to do that. If they mean we're a nation that's predominantly Christian, I agree. But the government isn't Christian. The government is largely secular. Now, then again, there's the people who wish to, instead of having freedom of religion, they wish this was a country freedom from religion. Mm-hmm. And I and a lot of other people resist excising every vestige of Christianity from our public spaces. But then again, I'm certainly not for enforcing Christianity on our people through our government. So those are issues buried in here that it's important to use words carefully when we talk about, are we a Christian nation? Well, what does that mean?
Right. Well, to tag off of the last part that you said there, what would be the response, and any of you could respond to this, what would be the response to someone that as Les just indicated, I think there are people that are afraid that their ability to practice the religion is being infringed upon, either by slowly not being the majority any longer and being marginalized, and eventually, probably if trends continue, becoming a minority. And as I mentioned before, there are different flavors and levels of practicing of Christianity as far as that goes. But in that aspect, what would be your response to somebody that was concerned about the infringement of secularism, for instance?
I'll dive in on that.
Okay.
I think that is exactly what is happening trend-wise. And what's happening is that as a country, we have advocated religious liberty as long as Christians were in the majority. And, Christianity has unquestionably had a preferred status in this country. There's just a lot about our culture and our law that is closely aligned with Christianity. So when you see a societal trend of becoming more secular, less people respecting religion or particular aspects of our law or culture that are sort of based in Christianity, yeah, it creates fear. And I don't know, all I can say is that in the long run, I think that we have to anticipate, and when I say long run, it's like I don't know when the end of time is going to be, but in end times, Christians are going to be persecuted. We have to expect that. That's certainly Revelation tells us that.
They are now in many parts of the world.
Absolutely.
We're just talking about here and now. We're blessed that we're not being persecuted now.
Right. So, I understand the fear motivation, but on the one hand, we need to kind of expect that. And interestingly, a lot of the organizations that are behind this Christian nationalism, it's kind of like you kind of wonder about their Christian behavior. It's like it's almost as if the ends justify the means. It's like we want to be able to call it Christian, we want to dominate the politics, and we can act in any kind of unchristian manner to get there.
Yeah, along those lines, I saw a quote, and this is, I'm going to paraphrase it lest I butcher it, but Roger Williams basically said that alignment of a religion and a state in terms of gaining power for both, at the minimum, promotes hypocrisy, and at the worst is rivers of blood. So obviously we're probably talking more about the hypocrisy right now, but to the other end of things could become quite extreme. Go ahead, Doug.
I was just going to say, everywhere I've been, every country I've lived in, which is now going on 6 or 7, I can't remember the count, and that's the argument by the government, is we're in danger here. Our culture's in danger, our nation's in danger, and Russia, Armenia, and Georgia, the main instigators of this fear were Jehovah's Witnesses. I somewhat admired them. They were very zealous in their missionary work, going door to door. They'd get beat up, like in Georgia. They viewed that as evidence that they were the true religion, and they worked even harder. But this was the argument: is, hey, we're in danger. Our culture's in danger. I mean, right now.
Do you mean that the Christians were being endangered by the Jehovah's Witness philosophy and missionary activities?
Well, the Orthodox.
Well, in their history, they wrap up their history. So, like for me, there has to be a dividing line. I mean, if you're concerned about your religion becoming a minority, get involved in your religion and try to propagate it and have more people join it. But trying to get your government to protect your majority status, I haven't seen it help yet. In fact, it just hurts. For instance, right now in Russia, I don't know if you know this, but we're suffering too, the Seventh-day Adventist Church there. Jehovah's Witnesses are outlawed. They're a terrorist organization. So
You mean they're labeled a terrorist organization by the Russian
yes,
government?
I'm sorry. Thank you for clarifying that. Yes, I'm not saying they're a terrorist organization, but they are classified by the Russian apparatus as a terrorist organization. They cannot meet at all, and because they were going around and they were successful in getting converts. So they were out doing work, converting people to their belief in the Bible, the Watchtower Society, and in the Russian mind, for instance, the Russian Orthodox Church has saved and unified the Russian people. If you lose that, then you lose the Russian nation. So it's better to persecute a religious minority while it's still a religious minority before they destroy the whole nation, which is basically the argument for the crucifixion of Jesus.
Yeah, I was going to say, sound like a high priest.
Was, it's better one man die than
Sure.
the rest of the nation. So, whenever a majority is saying, hey, we have our rights trampled on, religious liberty isn't for the majority. The majority always is going to get, for the most part, religious liberty in the country, everywhere I've been. But religious liberty is for the little guys. Mm-hmm. And we'd have to put ourselves in the opposite, what if Orlando was 95% Seventh-day Adventist, and you had some missionaries from other groups coming in and calling us really bad names and telling us how bad we are. I'm sure if we controlled the mayor's council and all the different, it would be a temptation to say, wait a minute, they're ruining our Adventist atmosphere, our culture here, and we need to, just back them down a little bit, So I do think it's very easy to blur those lines of a secular government with your religion, and you start to tie that up in your history, and all of a sudden it becomes very easy to justify persecuting anybody that threatens whatever that religion was. And Mark is absolutely right. It's in the Middle East, it's Islam. And these same arguments were used there.
Right.
These Christian missionaries are destroying our nation. I was always accused of being a CIA agent. America's sending these guys over, the Adventists and Baptists, and they don't care, who. It's just anybody that's not, the part of the government or religion.
So one of the things that you have happen is that both religion and government try to co-opt each other and use each other. And that's, anywhere that you've seen this kind of religious nationalism, that's going on constantly. The religious leaders are using government for their purposes. The government is using religion for their purposes.
Well, in some respects, I could see it, in its essence, we've already pretty much as much said, it's a power grab. If you took it from a biblical perspective, you could even state it as it could potentially be viewed as a form of idolatry, in the aspect that you're actually making a grab for something that is allowing for an exercising of power, and that it's a desired position to be in, rather than expressing for people to have the ability for freedom of choice, freedom of conscience. And along those lines, I guess I would like to take us to a little bit of an aspect with regard to biblical background, lest we just stick completely on governmental aspects. Doug had mentioned that he's preached on the aspects of dominionism and relative to what does it mean to be in dominion or to rule over. And I guess in that regard, I would ask, relative to both what Jesus taught when he was here on earth, as well as what we understand to be, even going back to the Old Testament, what is our role in terms of Christians, both individually and in terms of participants in a membership of an organization such as the Seventh-day Adventist Church? What should be our expectation of the Seventh-day Adventist Church? And then holistically, if we were to ever so choose, what are your thoughts on practice in political life? There's a lot to unpack there, and so we can go back and touch each one of those. But I'd like to start, first of all, with at least who we're supposed to be following, which is Christ. So does anybody have any comments on that?
Years ago, I was a religious liberty director here, and I was invited to a couple of other places to speak, and I had to think about, what really is the the foundation for religious liberty. And for me, it goes right back to the Garden of Eden, in that humans were given a choice. And it's not, because they sinned, they weren't immediately killed. It's like, you have the choice, but you will also endure the consequences of your choice. And I think as you go throughout the Bible, you see again and again where God allows people, to sin really badly. And they still live, but ultimately they will experience the consequence of what they do. So most of the religious nationalism / Christian nationalism wants to deprive you of some of that choice. It wants to tell you what you should be doing. So that's kind of my idea of, the biblical foundation for religious liberty.
Very briefly, Jesus said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and unto God the things that are God's. That didn't make it clear where the dividing line is, but it tells you that there are certain things that aren't to be rendered to Caesar, and certain things that God has said, that's fine, let the government do it. And that comes back to our rights. For instance, under the First Amendment, not only do we have freedom of religion and freedom from establishment of religion, we also have freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. None of those rights are absolute. The old cliche, you can't yell fire in a theater. The government can require a demonstration to get a permit and limit it to certain times, places, and manners, even though there's a freedom of assembly and a freedom of speech. It's not an absolute freedom. And so those issues of where that dividing line is aren't articulated in the Bible, and reasonable men can differ as to what God meant and what we should do.
I would just add to that, the passages in the New Testament that talk about obeying and submitting to the kings and the governors. So the really interesting question to me is, now when it's a democracy and you as a citizen are part of the government, what are the implications of that? What are the implications as far as, what you vote for?
What is your
or
guidance?
who you vote for?
Right.
So it's not just, now we're not just talking about blind obedience to kings or governors. It's like, you're now part of the process. You're now part of you've got responsibility. What is your responsibility?
But people, in my experience, there was a time when many devout people believed that no Christian could be involved in any politics. And yet the fundamental aspect of democracy is it's supposed to represent people, the majority, and protect the minority. What's wrong with a Christian doing that? And how far do you take it?
I'd like to tug on something both of you are speaking of with regard to participation in public life, whether it were formally or just as a voting citizen. How does one grapple with the aspects if many times people align with partisan politics, just plain and simple, and I hate to say it, but sometimes I think people get in a groove of thinking a particular party is supportive of their belief system and their belief system only. But when you really get down to it, if you look across the board of at least what the two major parties support, and for that matter, if you want to go even to some of the lesser known parties, how should a believer associate their belief system, evaluate their belief system with their voting priorities?
Can I just speak to maybe somewhat of that question in your previous question? Mm-hmm. I do think it differs from country to country. I've seen, For instance, in Azerbaijan, when I was living there, the president always won the election there by literally 99.4% every election. And it was just a semblance of a government. I mean, he ran it, and to encourage an Adventist to get involved in that, a believer, you almost have to go against conscience, just in ethical principles of how you're going to get involved. What Mark brings up here in America, it's a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Jesus encourages us to be salt and light, representatives to secular people that aren't believers of how civil discourse can be handled. And I think as far as partisan, and I mentioned it in the sermon, most denominations skew very heavily in one, partisan political party in North America. Our denomination is unique in that sense, in that we're fairly evenly divided with a large number of independents. I think already that's on the right track, because it's, I've been in some churches where they hand out guides on how a Christian should vote. And it goes through a whole list of ranges, and every Christian should vote like this, and I don't know. Again, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. If we're following God and we're on the religious side of things, we allow our people freedom, and we do have Seventh-day Adventist legislators in Washington, D.C. I know we have one of our church members here at Markham Woods is going to run for Congress, and that's a good development. Why not? Why not be a representative of our religion, live out our faith, and how can we help form a better, a more perfect union?
I guess to give you a little more background to where I'm really trying to push you, and you were on the right track.
Sorry,
there.
maybe I'm too politically correct, Gary, for you.
I believe as responsible Christians, if we're given a free will and a freedom of conscience, that we're expected to actually be able to think. Just like our salvation is really up to no one else other than us deciding to accept Christ's gift. In that aspect, there's no one else that's responsible for making decisions for me in other regards as well. So while my belief system probably aligns in general very closely with the church that I belong to, I guess what I'm getting at is, from a Christian's perspective, we're given two pillars, before we even go back to the Ten Commandments, two pillars: love for God, love for man. And I guess what I'm really getting at is, how do we take our Christian experience and actually make that a part of not only protecting what we believe are our own interests for religious freedom, but also, as you both have spoken about, Mark and Les, with regard to protecting the minority. A good law, as I think you said, Les, isn't necessarily for the majority. It's actually to protect the minority. So that's more where I'm trying to go. Maybe that helps a little bit.
I don't know if I'm on your track, but let me just make a couple of clarifications. Under our current law, particularly tax law, religious organizations that are tax exempt are permitted by law to advocate for issues. They are not permitted to endorse or oppose specific candidates. So they
At the risk of
can,
losing their tax exemption.
right. That's what I'm saying. That's
And
not a First Amendment thing as much as it is, if you want to get the privilege of a tax exemption, then here are some ground rules for it.
Right.
So I just wanted to clarify those things, and then say that where it gets tricky, let's say that the person becomes a member of Congress. Okay, how should one act in that capacity? Is it appropriate for Christians to try and, quote, Christianize the law? In other words, make the law comport with their theological perspectives, whether that be on something like abortion, homosexuality, or any of another list of the moral issues that churches are concerned with. It's like, should they be trying to impose their theology on the nation?
You're tracking with me on your last part there. I'm more on an individual basis rather than an actual institution.
What do you think?
What do I think? Well, I will say the general aspect is you're challenged many times with what protects your pocketbook, what protects your livelihood. And sometimes I think we think about that more than we think about what matters for our neighbor or our brother. And actually putting these questions together to hold this discussion, it's given me a lot of thought about what my voting principles are, for one. And I think many times, myself included, we should really check ourselves at the door and make sure we're not just looking out for number one. And that's really the reason I'm asking the question. I've really had a lot of thought about this over the last 3 weeks that we've been chatting about this. So that's my perspective on it.
I think the founding fathers, when I got back to America after living overseas, I'd read a book on the Constitutional Convention, and one of the things that surprised me is how open they were to religion and yet how afraid they were of government religion. So it was like this dichotomy of, they realized that for any nation, you need a moral backbone. You need people that are moral living in your society. Where does that come from? It was the government's job to educate the morals, and that's where the line is. So it can be thin, but I think that's why it was such a vigorous, robust debate at the convention, was how do you track that middle ground of where, correct me if I'm wrong, but the U.S. government in the very beginning, I think, paid clergy salaries.
I think some state governments did. I don't know that the US
maybe not the
government
federal, but there was some tax money being paid.
Oh, in Virginia, it was clear that the church was part of the state's budget, or the Commonwealth's budget.
Yeah. So, how do you, in their minds, that wasn't so much a contradiction, is that, yes, we want religion. We need moral people living in our society for a government to exist. So when let's just say you run for Congress, I don't think the founding fathers would even say, well, he's a Seventh-day Adventist, his religion is going to, inform his decisions, inform his arguments on certain topics. But they could separate that from saying, but Gary probably shouldn't, say that Seventh-day Adventism is the government religion.
Right.
Well, going back to the Constitutional Convention, one thing that was stark in everybody's mind was the problem of state religions in Europe. Whether it was in England, Holland,
Yep.
Germany, France, Italy, they all knew that was bad, to have a state religion. And so even though in the several states prior to the United States, there were literally state religions in, as Les mentioned, Virginia, but others. And one of the reasons that the Baptists have such a strong religious liberty emphasis is because Roger Williams, who was a Baptist, got driven out of states and ended up having to go, was it Rhode Island?
Yes.
Yeah, and establishing a new state there where there would be religious freedom, because in a number of the states prior to the formation of the United States, there was no religious freedom. So when that Constitutional Convention was meeting, people were very aware of the problems that there had been with state religion, both in Europe and in the United States. So I think that's why it was, clear that that under the Constitution, we have the anti-establishment clause, which is there will be no establishment of religion in the United States.
And there's a provision in the Constitution that says no officer has a religious test, which means you can't keep somebody out of office because they're an Adventist or a Baptist or a Muslim. That was written by these people who were concerned to begin with. And history has shown us that instead of being enhanced, let me back up. When government and religion get mixed in together, religion doesn't get advanced, it gets corrupted. And so religion suffers when it's mixed with government. So people who think that, well, let's get the government to enforce our morality and enforce what we want, their religion loses its purity pretty quickly. And obviously the government itself suffers when it's only one religion. There's lots of dissent and lots of hostility and disputes between sections of the government. And obviously governments do better when it's peaceful.
It could collectively stagnate, I guess, is another way of looking at it.
Just a comment on the no religious test for office. Just to clarify that means there would be no legal test for office or legal prohibition. It does not mean that a person cannot take into consideration in their voting, what the candidate's religion is. So this came to the front very recently in the Senate confirmation hearings for Amy Coney Barrett, in which people on one side of the aisle were saying, well, it's improper to ask any questions about that because there's no religious test for public office. Well, it's like, no, there's no law that would prevent anybody, but nobody says that a person who's voting can't take something into consideration in the course of their vote.
That fits in with the idea that you ought to determine, for instance, if you're deciding whether to approve Mr. X for office, you ought to see what his values are. And maybe his religion, well, let's hope his religion influences his values.
So if he went to the Spaghetti Monsters church, you might say, no, I don't think I'm going to vote for that guy. But we couldn't have a law that said no members of the Spaghetti Monsters church can be a member of Congress.
Right.
I guess another thing, this is a great conversation, with regard to the aspects of what we normally go through on a checklist, whether it's confirming a justice, whether it's identifying somebody that we're going to vote for. We normally check off the things that are going to suit and align to us most favorably. Kind of circling back to something that we had talked about earlier in the conversation with regard to Christianity, at least in its I hate to say purest form, because who defines purity? But we'll use that language for lack of a better term. As it continues to seemingly become gradually the minority, how do we balance protecting what is favorable to ourselves as individuals and deal or grapple with the aspects that seem to be contrary to us but are actually favorable as far as protecting both minority and potentially majority rights and provisions? What are some thoughts in that regard?
Well, it's interesting. I had to do some thinking on this because you had to ask yourself: would you rather be the majority in a country that has no religious freedom, or a minority in a country that has religious freedom? And most people, it seems to me, over the course of history, would rather be in a society where you were a majority but don't have religious freedom. Because as long as I'm in the majority, well, those troublemakers over there, yeah, they want some freedom, but I mean, I've got freedom, so I'm fine. But it's as soon as we feel that threat that all of a sudden, hey, wait a minute, what if I want to leave the majority religion and I can't, or it's a very high cost to leave it? So, I mean, I think, I don't think Seventh-day Adventists are in danger of becoming a majority religion here in the U.S. So I think, our position has been, and we just protect everybody's religious freedom.
First they came for the Jews, then they came for
Yeah.
A and B and C, and when they came for me, there was nobody there to protect me.
Yeah. And that's always a minority opinion, because it's, I mean, who wants to stand up to the, current culture and current thinking? And sometimes it creates heated discussions. And, every country I was in argued that really their country's at stake. Somehow, if this religion shrinks or becomes a minority religion, we're all in danger. And, we have to analyze, is that true? Because if you become a minority religion, but you still have religious freedom, true religious freedom, where you can practice, where you can, and you can even change religions. You could say, I don't like this religion, I want to go to another one. I remember, I think it was Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson had a statement on just how preciously divine a conscience is. Mm-hmm. And how that ability to choose, that ability to, I know it's a high road, but I just think it's something that we should aim for, and regardless of consequence of whether we feel that threat of becoming a minority or not.
Just an observation about when you have a national religion, it tends to become kind of a civic religion. It's like it's not really, the people are not really invested in the religion. They're not typically all that concerned about their piety or following the principles of their religion. They're just concerned about it being the top religion.
Yeah.
And that's why you could say, okay, as long as I'm in the majority, I don't care if there's not religious freedom, because it doesn't affect me. And most of them are not really seriously practicing their religion. And that's one of the problems with this merger of church and state, is the fact that it just guts the religion. It turns it into a civic exercise.
I was going to throw one other thought out there, and then I'm going to give each one of you an opportunity to actually make any closing comments you want. We're about 5 minutes to the hour. I think we've touched upon this as well, and I just probably will throw it out there, and unfortunately we won't have time to fully discuss it unless you want to touch upon it in your closing comments. But one of the things that I think our nation has actually prospered under is diversity. And diversity, because there are many minorities as well as a majority, allows for the expressing of multiple views. Without that expressing of multiple views, you don't have the expansiveness with which religious liberty should be protected. Without the voice of the minority and the attention to it, you don't know what the expansion of that might need to be for all protection. And at the silencing or the absence of those voices, we begin to think that religious liberty and freedom only needs to protect a certain amount within the masses. So with that, if you don't mind, Doug, I'll actually start with you, and if you have any closing comments, and we'll just work the way around the table.
Yeah, I'll just, I think the thing we have to guard on is the collective identity when we talk about this. Collective way of thinking. Even in the Bible, the centurion converted and his whole household with him. Sounds a bit strange to us in a Western context where we're used to religious freedom, but if you look at history, people are not, it's always been the nation. In fact, I read a book, I gave it to Jim to read. Genghis Khan was one of the first rulers ever to give the right to the individual to choose a religion. There have been other nations that have given nations their right to choose which religion, but the individual. And anytime you talk about freedom, even Paul in 1 Corinthians 10, he said, for my people, the Jews, have a collective veil over their eyes, and he uses the plural pronoun. And then in the next verse, he says, but when he turns or she turns, he uses the singular. So it's like this collective mindset, but then when coming to Christ, it's the individual. And I really think if we retain the importance of the individual, more religious liberty issues come into focus.
I would say that our treatment of the topic today has been more at the 30,000-foot view level. And it would be fair for everybody to say, yeah, well, so what's really going on? You know, what is this Christian nationalism in the United States? What are we talking about? And I'd say if we go down to the 10,000 or 5,000 foot level, you know, that there is a lot of Christian right political activity, particularly at state levels, that are seeking to bring this Christian nationalism, privilege of for Christianity, enforcing certain, quote, Christian positions on moral issues. So that stuff is going on, and it might be, if you're listening to, you know, Christian radio, some Christian radio stations or programs, or certainly some programs on television, it might be tempting to go, yeah, we should be, you know, I'm a Christian, I should be all for that. And, you know, the thing that you have to always bear in mind is, well, whatever we do to somebody else could be turned around on us. So our church, for example, going back 25 or 30 years, decided not to get involved in the gay marriage debate because they viewed that as being advocacy for a, quote, Christian position by Christian organizations to legislate their particular, you know, topic of interest. We were always concerned that, you know, if it's okay to do that, then why isn't it okay to say, well, we're going to legislate Sunday worship? You know, so when you get into, and that's not, you know, that's always the biggest boogeyman for Adventists, but, you know, there are other things, and it's like you have to be careful that you don't do to somebody else politically something you wouldn't want being done to you. And so that's always an issue when you take one of these big public issues and say, okay, well, if we advocate and try to legislate the, quote, Christian position, what happens when we're on the wrong side of that?
Les?
Well, I never really thought of Genghis Khan as the advocate for liberty. He was known for other things, and I think that's reflective of a lot of governments, that good and bad can both be in the same government. From the big picture, it seems to me that if you're in the majority, the moral is to love your neighbor. If you're in the minority, it's to love your God with all your heart, your mind, and soul, and hope for the best.
Well, I want to express my appreciation for the three of you joining me today. And I think you've summarized most of the thoughts that I was going to express. I did want to touch upon one thing that Mark said in closing. We purposely stayed at the 30,000 foot level today. And I do not want you coming away from this that these guys are never going to get into, or none of these sessions are ever going to get into any of the really difficult topics. We will touch upon those at some point or another. It may not be us, it may be some individual or another panel. But please stay tuned for future sessions that we have. And at this point, if you all would please bow your heads with me, we'll have a closing prayer. So Heavenly Father, we thank you that we can assemble together and that we can have open discussions. We thank you that we are able to actually talk openly and thoughtfully about these matters. And we thank you very much that we are afforded the freedoms that we are in this country to practice our religion and our beliefs as we see fit. We thank you for the opportunity to have shared this, and we pray that those that have witnessed this conversation, that it will open up opportunities to discuss other matters of this sort, and that we can join again at the next session and have a lively and informed discussion. We pray these things in your name. Amen.
Gary, are we going to invite any questions, or are we going to save that for later?
We, interestingly enough, did not get any questions submitted over the course,
might
but we
be.
can, if anybody in the audience, I think we're going off air right now, but if anybody locally here wants to raise any topics, we can certainly entertain those. Jim?
How is the virus and all these closed downs affecting churches?
So the question was, how is the virus and all these closed downs affecting churches? Anybody want to try to address that?
That happens to be a topic that I've just done some research on this week. And there have been, as you know, there have been executive orders all over the place. And they've had basically different thresholds. And interestingly, this issue has made its way to the Supreme Court 4 or 5 times already. It's normally in the context of a motion for a preliminary injunction. Now, that's a procedural thing that I don't want to go into really deeply, but it basically is asking the court to enjoin the enforcement of an executive order until the issue can be fully litigated in the courts below. So there have been 2 decisions by the Supreme Court early on in the COVID pandemic that refused to enjoin.
Were they decided on the merits, or was it
No.
just we will not decide?
Well, what they were saying is, we will not give a preliminary injunction enjoining the enforcement of that executive order.
What does that mean in English?
What that means is, the executive order is going to remain in force, be enforceable by the state while the litigation is working its way up the pipeline. The day before Thanksgiving, the third of this series of cases was decided. It involved the Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn, New York, against Andrew Cuomo, the governor. And we'll probably get into this much deeper in a later session when we've got more time. But this time around, they got a 5-person majority that said, okay, in this case, we are going to enjoin the enforcement of this injunction. And there was another case going along parallel with it.
That means prohibit the enforcement.
Yeah, so there was another case parallel with it involving a Jewish congregation or / organization. I'm not sure if they're a denomination or what, but in New York. And these were affected by, whether they were located in a red zone, an orange zone. And if they were in a red zone, they could have no more than 10 attendees in the church at any given time, regardless of the size of the church. If they were in an orange zone, they could have no more than 25, regardless of the size of the church. And there had been some similar numbers like that in the earlier cases, which came out of California and Nevada. In the New York case, it was probably a little bit more extreme because certain businesses that were classified as, quote, essential businesses could operate without restriction on the number of people. So whether it was a grocery store or Macy's or a casino or whatever. And then under the orange zone thing, it was even if it was a non-essential business, they could still, at their discretion, allow however many people they wanted into their facility. So you had an extreme hard limit on churches, regardless of size of the facility. I mean, the number of occupants that they could have, versus these non-religious venues. And so the court granted the injunction in that case, prohibiting the enforcement of the executive order against those two churches. Now, this is a signal to other governments, but technically it only involves those two specific organizations in New York. But it's, you know, it's the Supreme Court giving a signal to everybody else around the country. This is how we're likely to rule. So it's been a development. At the beginning of the COVID pandemic, they basically gave the governors a lot of latitude, because at that point nobody knew how to cure the disease, how to prevent people from dying. So it was like, you can take, you know, rather blunt measures to try and stop this from happening. But the further we go down through it and learn more about it and learn ways of operating safely, you know, they're starting to come to the aid of the churches and say, okay, as long as you're going to do the same, you know, masking, social distancing, sanitizing, all of those things that the other businesses have to do, you know, we're not going to tolerate. And it was only a 5-4 decision, and I might add, there was a spat going on, a personal spat between Justice Gorsuch and Justice Chief Justice. I'm having a scene.
Roberts.
Mm-hmm. You know, where they're literally like targeting each other's language individually. Justice Roberts said some things in the first of the cases that got to the Supreme Court where they denied the injunction. I guess they didn't have enough on the court for a 5-4 decision. Now that they have another Supreme Court justice, there is enough for a 5-4 decision, and there is a direct rebuttal of Roberts by Gorsuch. And it's kind of unusual to see justices taking personal pot shots like that at each other. But the long story short is, it was a lot more restrictions were allowed early on in the pandemic. They're less likely to be tolerated now.
I'm going to actually have to close the comments and questions down. I see a couple other hands. We can talk offline. They're actually needing to close the feed down now for us to stay on schedule. But if you'd like, we can gather offline. For those of you that joined us online, feel free to submit any other comments to the feed. If we did not get to, we will try to collect those. We are not going to discard them, and we will make sure that they are looked at and addressed at a future date. Again, I want to express my appreciation for everyone that joined us in person as well as online, and have a happy Sabbath.